Hello class, I hope that the first couple of weeks were kind to you and that your third week is off to a good start. This week I wanted to talk a little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois' work, The Souls of Black Folk. Specifically, I wanted to talk about a term that was popularized as a result of this work, which is the term double consciousness. There's a lot that we could unpack from that work, and I think all of it is important, but particularly for this class, I think one of the best things that we can do is focus on the double consciousness part of it. It's a huge theoretical concept, and after this work was published, it was sort of looked at in a variety of ways by different scholars, and it's used as an idea for the way that particularly oppressed people sort of navigate through the world. And so I think it is important that you have an understanding of what that term means, what it implies, and sort of how you might be able to recognize it, I guess you'd say. Let's get into this a little bit. First, I want to read to you the passage from which this term was derived, okay? So in W.E.B. Du Bois' work, it reads as follows: "The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil." So I'm going to stop here for a second. The seventh son is this sort of mythic quality, right? There's supposed to be this sort of power or whatnot in like literature and myth and whatever. The seventh son is sort of seen as this character who's supposed to have like special abilities, right? And born with a veil is also a term that has to do with this sort of mythology within Black culture. So at the time, if a person was born with a veil, which would mean like the placenta would sort of sit in a certain way across the face, it was said that that child was born with a veil, that they could see things, and that what it meant was they could see things that other people could not. Okay. And this was a fairly popular belief within Black culture back in W.E.B. Du Bois' day. Okay. I'm not 100% sure if that is a continued mythology within Black culture, but it was at least back then. So he's sort of playing on these ideas of the seventh son and being born with a veil, having a special power of being able to see things. Okay. So I'm going to start over now that I've interjected. The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's own soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels this two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So we can even see here, so he sort of goes into this, idea of having a second sight, of understanding the world differently, of the Black man having this sort of two-ness or this double consciousness about him. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Du Bois' writing here is an allusion to the idea of having to consciously view oneself through the eyes of and navigate through the intricacies of the predominantly homogenous, dominant culture and the power structures that exist therein, but also being aware and being able to navigate through the minority culture to which they are also a part. Often this double consciousness puts an individual in a position of having to learn to navigate between two different contexts and the divergent expectations that come with that. For example, the way they speak, act, or perhaps even dress when among predominantly Black people and in predominantly Black spaces might run counter to the ways that they are expected to act in majority white spaces. Now, historically, to be accepted into predominantly white spaces, Black individuals were expected to assimilate and thus adhere to the expectations of the dominant culture while they inhabit them. At the same time, though, the culture they come from and also the culture where they spend a good chunk of their time remains important to them and thus remains a huge part of their life. In a sense, Du Bois is describing the crux of humans, particularly those of oppressed backgrounds, of having to always be aware of the space they are inhabiting at any given moment, and then having to adjust their presentation, behavior, language, etc. of themselves to adhere to the space in which they find themselves in that moment. Instead of being able to just act natural or in accordance to their own sense of culture, in this case, Black culture, they must instead code switch to present themselves in ways that are considered acceptable within the dominant, and in this case, white culture. This culminates in a split self, a split consciousness that is constantly having to navigate when to turn off one part of the self in favor of the other. Now, to a degree, some of us probably understand this in certain relative experiences, right? When you are here in college, for example, you probably do have to code switch. Academic language, for example, when you have to write for a class. Academic language is not how pretty much any of us actually speak, right? Those of us who have been ingrained in academia for a long time, we probably find that that part of ourselves sort of comes out sometimes, but we typically have to sort of code switch in those moments. But by and large, unless you become an academic, right, being in or having to code switch your language for those, those moments is probably not as inhibitive or prohibitive as having to like constantly be on, right? You don't always have to know every single moment of every single day and probably have to code switch like 12,000 times a day based on those things, based on academic language, right? So it's a very niche sort of piece of this, right? But for individuals of oppressed groups, and obviously Du Bois is talking about the Black experience specifically, but I would say probably this is true within a lot of minority cultures that live within dominant societies where that is not the dominant thing, that this is probably true for them as well. They probably constantly find themselves having to switch between different styles of language, different styles of body language, or different styles of dress, perhaps. So this is something that is constantly sort of weaved in. You are constantly sort of having to see yourself through the lens of the dominant culture and know what is expected of you when you find yourself in spaces that are predominantly controlled or inhabited by the people of those dominant cultures. And so clearly I'm a white person, and I cannot speak on behalf of any Black person or any minority group about, how this feels or how this works for them. But this is in essence what Du Bois is saying. And even as a white person on the outside sort of looking into this process, I can only imagine that having to be in this sort of perpetual state of double consciousness is likely a very exhausting thing to have to do. So yeah, this is in essence a quick video lecture to sort of explain that particular concept. and sort of give you a little bit of insight about what that means and how it operates in the real world. So for our discussion this week, you will be talking a little bit about perhaps whether double consciousness, well, I guess it depends on the question that you choose, but you will be talking a little bit about or exploring the ways in which double consciousness either is or is not symbolically sort of used within the film Us. And the other option is whether or not, well, I guess I'll be talking about double consciousness either way, but the other option is talking about how or in what ways this idea of double consciousness might be similar to some of the ideas of mimicry as it appears in the article that I had you read for this week. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. If you have questions, feel free to message me on Teams and I will try and get to those ASAP. Okay. Have a good week.